people in positions of political power should surely not be using incendiary rhetoric. What do you think about that? And perhaps more importantly still, do you trust them? Do you trust them on Ukraine, Russia? Do you trust them to handle this situation in the Middle East? Do you trust those institutions at all? The government, the legacy media? Do you trust them? Let's have a look at what Tucker Carlson's saying, and let me know what you feel about what Tucker's saying on this subject.
So there's a lot at stake in how we encourage Israel to respond to the horrifying Hamas attacks. Wisdom and long-term thinking are essential, but you will not be surprised to learn that is not what we are getting. Watch this person, for example, who happens to be the media's pick for President of the United States.
This is not just an attack on Israel. This is an attack on America because they hate us just as much. And what we have to understand is this is the reason that we have to unite around making sure our enemies do not hurt our friends. America can never be so arrogant to think we don't need friends, just like we needed them on 9/11. That's why Ukraine needs us when Russia's doing this. That's why Israel needs us when Hamas and Iran are doing this. And I'll say this to Prime Minister Netanyahu, finish them. Finish them. Hamas did this. You know Iran's behind it. Finish them. They should have hell to pay for what they've just done.
This was an attack on America, she says, but in fact it was not. And for that reason we must, quote, finish Iran, a nation of nearly 90 million people. What are we watching here? This is not sober leadership. She's a child, and this is the tantrum of a child. Ignorant, cocksure, bloodthirsty. Yet no one in Washington scolded her for it. In fact, they aped her hysteria. Here's fellow neocon Lindsey Graham just spelling it out and calling for the bombing of Iran.
So I've been on the phone all day to the Mideast, and I've told our allies and people with connections to Iran what I would do. I would tell Iran that if Hezbollah attacks Israel, we're going to come after you, the Iranians, and have a coordinated effort between the United States and Israel.
Do you wonder that complex, tragic, awful as this situation is and continues to be, that there are people that are exploiting it? Do you consider that the people in Congress that are purchasing stocks in weapons manufacturers are exploiting this situation? Do you think that those that are pushing an agenda to increase expenditure on the Ukraine-Russia conflict are exploiting this situation? Do you think that politicians, such as we have just been shown, are exploiting this situation to increase military tensions, to increase military expenditure? Do you think if we investigated the funding of Lindsay there and Nikki there, we might find that there are donations from weapons manufacturers and other vested interests?
Hello everybody. Okay, this week we're going to cover news. I don't usually cover current events in my videos, but I think for this week it's important for us to get a handle on what's happening and what's not happening, and to get our minds in the right place over all of these current events going on in Israel. Now, I learned a long time ago during the Iraq War not to get caught up in the hype that's being perpetuated by the news that, had me cheering a genocide and a war crime, in my opinion. And ever since then, I've been a lot more leery about jumping on the bandwagon when America wants to go to war. Now, this particular thing is a little bit different, so I thought it would be good for us to learn the history. Now I'm going to start with a little clip from a guy I watch sometimes on YouTube for Canadian updates because I'm in Canada. And his channel is Mr. Sunshine Baby. So his statements kind of pushed me over the edge a bit to make a video like this at this time. So let's just hear from him for a minute.
So there's a lot of weird, wrong info circulating out there, and we don't really know right now what's true and what's not. And the longer we wait, the more that the mainstream media has their grips on the narrative. So will we ever know the exact truth? Probably not. And that feels there's parallels between what's happening now and what happened with the war between Russia and Ukraine when that first broke out, where you were just exposed to this overwhelming amount of information out there. But what we all can agree on is advocating for peace and not targeting innocent civilians, women, and children. There's rules of warfare basically, and it feels like both sides have broken rules of warfare, and the West, the powerhouse of the world, America, has decided to back one side over the other, and it's just hard to know what's real. But the truth.
So we can see that, young people especially, they're not big on history, and that these events come up, and many people, there's a lot of agendas being pushed, and there's a lot of people who don't understand what happened before, and what the timeline is on these things and why these things are happening. So we're going to talk about that today. Now, a lot of Christians would say, well, you have to support Israel because you're a Christian. You have to be 100% behind Israel. And I'll just point out a little bit from the book of Jonah here. Now, remember, Jonah, he was sent to preach the gospel or preach against the city of Nineveh in Assyria. And Nineveh repented. And then God did not want to destroy Assyria because Nineveh repented. And Jonah got angry. He was angry because he wanted Nineveh to be destroyed, because it was a very idolatrous place, and Nineveh was responsible for a lot of suffering in the world at that time. So, and after Nineveh repented, starting in chapter 4 of Jonah, verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry. And he prayed unto the Lord, and said, I pray thee, O Lord, was not this my saying when I was yet in my country? Therefore I fled from before into Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil. Therefore now, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And he's angry because God is not going to destroy the city. Then the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? And Jonah went out of the city, and he sat on the east side of the city, and he made a booth, and he sat under it in the shadow, till he might see what would become of the city. He's sitting there waiting for the city to be destroyed. I'm going to be mad until I see that city gone. So, as it came about, God caused a gourd plant, some kind of a melon plant or something with big leaves, to make a shadow over Jonah. And Jonah was very glad for the plant because he was being cooled off, and the sun wasn't beating down on him anymore. And then the plant died the next day. And then Jonah was grieved that the plant died. And then God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? And he said, I do well to be angry, even unto death. So he's mad that the plant died. And then God said, You had pity on the plant for which you did not labor, neither made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. And should I not spare Nineveh, that great city, where are more than 60,000 people that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle? So should I destroy all of them? Because shouldn't I be concerned about all of that? And you're concerned about this plant because it affects you. So that's the lesson in the end of Jonah, that we should try to see the bigger picture, I think, and not put skin in the game where we don't really have any skin in that game. That yeah, Israel believes in the same Bible as we do, and sometimes yeah, Israel is seems to be on the right side of things, but they are on the edge of possibly committing a great atrocity right now. And not all of the people in Gaza are guilty. There's a lot of innocent people in both Israel and in Gaza. They're doing what they can to move the population because the terrorists are using them as human shields. And I would remind you, by the way, they voted for the terrorists. So, you know, there's a lot of positives and negatives to be said on both sides. Nothing is always so clear and easy. So it's usually a kind of a mess. So I support innocent people everywhere. And, you know, even though Israel seems to be the person in the right in this case, it's like they say, because of Israel's attitude towards the Palestinians, that all this hatred is drummed up. And there is some truth to that, but the terrorism seems to be based on hatred all of the time, and that is a big negative. Like, who has a national day of hate? There's only one group that has a national day of hate, and you know, there's a lot of you know, the children in the schools learning how to be terrorists. You know, I'd say that is really, really wrong. And so, you know, there's a lot of really negative things to be said about the Palestinians. And, but even then, there's a lot of people who are just want to live and maybe are just caught up in all of this as much as we are, you know, and it's not a good time to start calling on hatred against other people. You know, like Canada right now is having the National Day of Hate, so they have to protect the Jews, all the Jewish communities, and then there's some people retaliating against that. Some Christian or Jewish people retaliating back, so they have to protect the Muslims too. And it's like now they're protecting both sides from each other. So there has to be a point when the hatred stops. And this is my point today, that you know, don't get caught up in this stuff too much. It's really, really not good. Now, having said of all of that, we're going to look into some of the history about Israel and Palestine and see what is this conflict really about, and what is the history. So that's where we're going to go now, so that at least you can understand how this is, why this has happened, and what the who the players really are, because you're never going to get a clear answer. Each side is going to say only good things about themselves and only bad things about the other side, and that's the problem. And the news, they're not big on researching anything. They're just pushing a narrative. It seems, they're pushing what people want to hear or what the government is telling them to push. That's all they are now. They're propaganda machines. So you can't trust the news anymore. Um, you have to do your own research. You have to understand what's really going on. So we're going to look into it now. And before I do, don't forget to smash the like button. It helps my channel a lot. And share and subscribe. And thank you. So let's move on with the history. Okay, first a bit about the history of Israel and Palestine. Now, during the time of Jesus Christ, the Levant is that strip of land along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. And the history of the Levant at the time of Christ, most of what we call Israel today was Judea, and Judea was this Jerusalem, and south of it was mostly populated by the Jews, and the area around the Sea of Galilee to the north was also mostly Jewish population, but it was more of it was Jewish controlled maybe, but more of a international population there. And then in between, in between Galilee and Jerusalem, that area was Samaritans, and the whole area was part of the Roman Empire, and the Romans ruled over the Jews and the Samaritans, but for the most part, they rather absorbed other religions than stamping them out. The Greeks would tend to stamp religions out and make them all follow Greek religion, while the Romans, who were the next empire after the Greek, they tended to absorb religions. And they didn't absorb the Jewish religion because the Jewish religion was non-polytheistic. So they absorbed Egyptian and Babylonian and other religions, though. All the polytheistic religions seem to collectively just join up with each other very easily, because it's easy to add more gods if you're already polytheistic. But if you're monotheistic, then you're kind of excluded from that party. So after Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple, and he was crucified and rose from the dead, the Jews in about 70 AD, they rebelled against the Romans. There was a huge uprising because of events that had happened in Jerusalem and around there, from the Romans taking taking too much tax and too many violations of Jewish custom. There was a big revolt, and the Romans sent a couple of legions in to quell the revolt, and they lost a couple of their top legions to the Jews. And that's when Titus and his father went in, and they ended up besieging Jerusalem and destroying the city and the temple in 70 AD. And the revolt was quashed at that time for the most part. And then in about 135 AD, there was another even bigger revolt, massive revolt of the Jews against the Romans. And that was a bloody war. And after the Jews were quashed in that war, they were expelled from the whole area. They were expelled from the region, from Jerusalem and from Judea, and so they spread out into the nations around there. And the Romans even went so far as to rename Judea, and they renamed it Palestine. And why did they call it Palestine? I think that they looked into the history, and they saw that Israel and the Philistines were always at war. And so they named it Palestine as another screw you to the Jews. We're going to name it after your greatest enemy. So they called the area Palestine, and it remained to be called Palestine right up until about 600s AD, when the Muhammad and the Muslim um, religion was born there in Arabia, and they ended up invading Palestine, and it was a kind of the idea was like um, join our religion or die. And so the Islamic religion spread throughout the entire Middle East within a few hundred years. And so Palestine became a part of the Muslim Caliphate. And it remained part of the Muslim Caliphate. Aside from the Crusades, which was a window of time when Christians had won back Jerusalem, and then they lost it again to the Muslims. So for the most part, it remained a part of a Muslim caliphate up until World War One. In World War One, the Muslim caliphate, or the entire Middle East, was called the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire. And the Ottoman Empire sided with the Axis powers in World War One. And as we know, the Axis powers lost. And from then on, the French and the British divided the Ottoman Empire among themselves. The French took more of the northern side, Syria and Iraq area, while the British took the southern part, the Palestine and Arabia. Now, this is called the French and the British Mandate. And the Arabians, this was a time, like in World War One, was a time of Lawrence of Arabia, who was a British, led the British, made a deal with the Arabs. If you help us overthrow the Ottomans, then we will give you land. And so the British ended up giving Saudi Arabia to the Saudis who helped them. And that's how Saudi Arabia became parted up. And the entire Middle East that we see today was what was parted out by the British and the French into Syria, Iraq, Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and then what they did was they had the area called Palestine. Now the Jews, they held some pretty powerful positions and a lot of political power in Britain, and a lot of elite people were Jews who had an idea of restarting Israel in Palestine. And a lot of that came from the Nazis in World War II going after the Jews. And the Jews were put on ships. They were put on ships and kicked out of Germany, and they went all over the world, and they were rejected by every country. Nobody would let them in. And even Canada rejected them. And then a lot of them, and the ships went back to Germany. And that's what is known as the final solution, because that solution didn't work. They had the final solution, which was the gas chambers in Nazi Germany. So the Jews, you can understand that they're like, we need our homeland back because nobody else wants us, and we're not going to survive if we don't have our own homeland. And so a part of Rwanda was offered to them, but they refused that. They said, well, if we're going to have a homeland, we want it to be our homeland in Palestine. And so at the time, the British owned Palestine. They were running it because they had won it in World War One. So and they had parted out among all the Arab nations. They had parted out Arabia, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. That they had parted these things out. And so the Jews petitioned the British government to build a homeland for Israel in Palestine. And the British government didn't exactly do that, but what they did was they allowed the Jews to purchase land. And a lot of Jews moved into Palestine and just started to settle and to purchase land from the Arabs. These are not Palestinians, they're Arabs in Palestine, okay? Most of the Middle East is Arab descent. They're a mixture. Because of the Muslim invasions, the Arab seed was sown all over the Middle East. So they're kind of a mixture between Arabs and what was there before the Arabs. So the Jews, they started to, in the 30s, in the 40s, after the war, they started to settle there. And even before that time, even before World War One, there was a small Jewish community there, and there was very few people there in the early 20th century. It was a pretty desolated place, small villages here and there, and a lot of them, most of them were Arabs, and there was also Jews. And settling even in Jerusalem, it was just a village, really. So the Jews, after the Second War, they started to buy land and to settle there in a bigger way. There was a lot of businessmen were Jews, and there's a lot of money behind it to buy land, and it started to become a problem to the Arabs and in Palestine, that, oh, if we let these Jews get too much, then they're going to overrun us. And so there was some fights back and forth between the Jewish and the Arab communities under the British mandate in British Palestine. And then eventually, one day, in 1948, the British announced that they're leaving. They were dealing with these fights back and forth between the Jews and the Arabs. Now you have to understand, the Jews had purchased land. They bought it from Arabs and under British law. And but the Arabs, when they started to see the Jewish communities get bigger, they started to fight back and say, you can't come here. And the Jews would say, well, we bought this land, we're staying. So that was the problem then. And the British just kept keeping the revolts down and keeping the riots down. But there's a bit of a history there you can look into if you want to about the riots under the British Palestine. And then in 1948, one day the British announced, we're leaving. We're just going to leave, and we're going to let every country here be whatever they are. There's Saudi Arabia, there's Jordan, and there's Palestine, and the Jews, they were quite a large community by that time, and they were afraid that when the British leave, they were going to be on their own, and they were going to be fighting Arabs to stay where they had purchased the land, and they had a love for that land. And so in 1948, the British moved out. They moved their armies out. And that day, the Jews, in order to protect themselves, they announced the state of Israel, that they were a different state than the Arab state, and that they would make their own laws and follow their own customs in the lands that they had purchased. So it wasn't as big as Israel is today. It was just a much smaller area of the land that they had settled. And they wanted to be their own state and not living under Palestine. So then, that was the 6-Day War, when all the Arab nations, I can't remember offhand which ones, but it was like Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, at least those ones, and a few others, they all at the same time attacked Israel. And Israel had also purchased weapons and tanks, and they had their own little army. And they ended up fighting back, and they actually gained territory. And they gained, like, what is called Israel now, they gained that. So it's all is fair in love and war. So it's fair. They won that. They fought hard for that, and they won. And it wasn't them who started the war, you see. So then ever since then, we've had the UN get involved, and we've had the two-state solution, the one-state solution, and nothing has really happened. Now, after the 6-Day War, all the Arab states, they expelled. There was a lot of, now, since the Roman invasion of Judea, the Jews were spread out into all of these states that became Arab states, into the region all around the Levant. And after the 6-Day War, the Arab nations expelled all Jews from their nations. And where did they go? Well, naturally, they went to Israel. So Israel had gained all this land in the war, and all these Jews were expelled from the Arab nations. They had nowhere to go but Israel. So they all went to Israel, and Israel just boomed overnight. It became a huge nation overnight. And who created it? The Arabs created it. They expelled the Jews and sent them to Israel. They didn't send them there, but where else could they go? So this is how Israel became so big. And then what they also did was there were people that were displaced. There were Arab people that were displaced in Palestine, and they were in refugee camps after the war, and this was a problem too. Well, what did the Arab nations do? They sent more people, more Arab people into those camps, and they filled them to the brim because they wanted to create this political atmosphere that there's so many people suffering, we need that land. That was their intent. And so they weren't there to help them, they were there to use them. And it's been happening that way ever since. So now the people in Gaza, most of them actually believe that their family has been there for thousands of years, when it's for some of them it's true, but for some of them it's not true. But they all believe it because it's been told to them for 50 years. And um, and Israel has become the only democracy in the Middle East, supported by the United States and supported for the most part by Western nations, because they're seen as a little hope of sanity among the Arab nations, because the Arabs can be very violent, and they have a history of violence that, like the National Day of Hate. Who else has a National Day of Hate? We just saw that yesterday. So things like that. It's like we are a peaceful religion, but if you don't believe that, then we will kill you. Like that kind of attitude. So, and I'm not saying all Muslims are like that, but you see this. This is it's a big it's a big problem in the Muslim nations. So I say I stand for peace. You know, whoever wants peace, I stand with them out of anyone. And this is possibly going to be a horrific tragedy uh, of people. And Hamas is living in tunnels underneath Gaza and using their own people as shields. But these people voted for them. It's kind of like us, isn't it? We vote for these people that abuse us. So how can that happen? Well, we know how it can happen because it happens to us. So it's just where the money flows. And now all these nations are sending money to help these people, but the money doesn't go to the people. It goes to the terrorists, and it goes to weapons. So this is the real problem. And you know, we can't sit here on our high horse either, because we destroyed Iraq, we destroyed Syria, we destroyed Ukraine. For what? What was the reason for all of this? It was for oil, for money. Well, those aren't good reasons. So, you know, they tell you a lot of reasons, but if you look into the history, it's a far more complicated than what people make it. So, you know, there's good and bad to be said about both sides. Like in Israel, the Arabs living in Israel, they the nation of Israel tries to keep order, but they also have powerful people that want to expand, and they want to take the Arab land and settle in there, and there's this tendency to try to expand, and and despite of the mandates of the UN and all these other things, there's this fear that they will also get swallowed up. So there's this expansion that happens into what is known as Arab lands. And, you know, that's another problem. That's a negative to say about the Jews. So there are negatives and positives. And there are negatives, there's big negatives on the Arab side, big ones, to do with the violence. And you know, what do? They don't feed their people. Instead of feeding their people and building infrastructure, and helping people and trying to live peacefully. You know, if you want to grow your nation, how about if you just make everybody like your nation and do something good? But all they do is they seem to hate. You look at their schools. Like, how can you treat your children to be killers? Kindergarten. In kindergarten, they're learning how to kill. I mean, they probably lose a lot of respect because of that. And the only people that are following them are people who are ignorant of what's really going on. I just say it's just a mind bender on all sides. So I stand for whoever stands for peace out of any nation. Whoever stands for peace, I'm with them. Um, the, the, the problem that we have in the West here is our nations, you know, they will stand for peace when it's good for them and when there's money to be made. And that seems to be the bigger factor than actual peace. Because look at Ukraine. When Ukraine, after the Maidan revolution happened in Ukraine, the western half of Ukraine is Ukrainian and mostly descendants of Nazis who settled there after the war. And the eastern half of Ukraine is mostly Russian-speaking people. So what did they do after the revolution? They outlawed Russian-speaking people. They outlawed the Russian language in half of their country. And Russia stood up and said this is wrong, and then Ukraine, Western Ukraine attacked Eastern Ukraine because they speak Russian. And they said, no, we're not going to stop speaking Russian. And so then Russia stood on the sidelines and helped, of course, the Russian people because they were being slaughtered. And where was America when this was happening? Why didn't America and the NATO stand up and say, no, Ukraine, you can't attack half of your own people. You should be a peacemaker, maybe in between the West and the East. They could have been a peacemaker. They could have said, we're going to have a bilingual country, half speaking Ukraine, half speaking Russian. Canada's bilingual. Why can't you have a bilingual country? Nobody even talked about that. All they talk about is war. And it's because the political people in power, it's good for them to make money. That's what it's about. So, you know, I'm not buying into it. I'm just simply not buying into it. I'm buying into peace. If anybody wants to talk about peace, I will be all for that. So that's my spiel for today. I hope you picked up a little bit from all this and can learn. I don't think it's a big prophetic event going on right now. It's just more disgusting war. It's all it is. There will be wars and rumors of wars, but this is not the end yet. Thank you very much. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.